Right, good evening all. Yes, and welcome back to the Valley of the Kings. Um, and nice slide with sunshine, which I get the feeling probably many people are not in particularly clement conditions today. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today is the tomb of Seti I. And as Kate says, this has definite Bristolian connections. In fact, there are two reasons why I'm going to dedicate a whole evening to it tonight. One is because it is probably one of the finest examples of a tomb in the Valley of the Kings, and really is the starting point of the whole sort of second phase of tombs in the valley. But also, as Kate says, it has very definite Bristolian connections. And this all goes back to the 1810s, during what has been called the heroic age of Egyptology, or proto-Egyptology, when really is at a point where hieroglyphs are about to be getting towards decipherment. More is being known about Egyptian monuments, but also there is a first wave of Egyptomania, whereby people in Europe want information and also actual objects. And this leads to large-scale collecting, particularly by the various great powers, consuls general, in Britain's case, Henry Salt on the left there, which resulted in huge collections being amassed and ending up in various European museums. Interestingly enough, not generally in the museums of the country where the person who collected them was normally representing, but that's a completely different story. On the other hand, though, this period is also a period of great destruction. Although huge amounts of material are recovered, huge amounts are also destroyed in doing so, sometimes quite wantonly, sometimes in the name of science. And an example of that will come up a little bit later on. As far as the tomb of Seti I is concerned, in fact, that the Archaeology of the Valley of the Kings is concerned, the great figure here is Giovanni Battista Belzoni on the right there, who is a Genoese, but he came to the UK to make his fortune, learned engineering, made money by being a circus strongman, and went to Egypt to sell some hydraulic engineering to the Egyptian government, which was then heavily into the mode of trying to modernize the country. But when that fell through, he was engaged by Henry Salt to collect antiquities in his behalf, and then went on to do work on his own account as well. And there was a certain amount of debate between the two individuals as to what he was doing for Salt as his employee and what he was doing under his own flag. And Belzoni, although he certainly is fairly rough and ready, is certainly rather more scientific than most of his contemporaries. And some of that will come out in what I'm talking about tonight. But one of the things he does do with the material he collects in Egypt is stage what is probably the first ever blockbuster Egyptian exhibition at the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly in 1821 to 22, where he displayed most of his things he had found in Egypt and brought back to the UK, but also he displayed something which he couldn't bring back in a physical sense, which was replicas of the tomb of Seti I, our subject for tonight. A couple of chambers he actually made full-size casts, and these full-size plaster casts were displayed in the Egyptian Hall. But also he displayed a 1/6 scale model of the tomb. This was made up of facsimiles which had been prepared in the Valley of the Kings by partly by himself, but mainly by an Italian doctor and artist called Alessandro Ricci. And this is one of the corridor walls from that 1/6 model. And this, the sketch at the top, is how, as far as we can tell, it was basically displayed two sides of a room split down the middle. Now, these copies made by Ricci are amongst the earliest facsimiles ever made of Egyptian wall decorations, in the sense of attempting to be exact replicas rather than sort of artistic renderings. And it's also the first time an entire Egyptian tomb was copied, right the way from the entrance all the way to the far end. And in fact, nobody would do a complete tomb again until the latter part of the 19th century. And also another thing is that Belzoni didn't take any bits away of the tomb. All he took away were these copies. The only exceptions being a few pieces of stone which had fallen off the walls naturally. So unlike a lot of his contemporaries, he wasn't trying to cut things out of walls. He was simply taking away replicas of these things. After his premature death, while attempting to travel to Timbuktu, not long after the exhibition had taken place, his material all passed to his widow, Sarah, who seems to be a Bristolian by origin. There's a lot of debate still about where she came from, but there seems to be a lot of evidence that she did actually have West Country roots and possibly even Bristolian roots. And she eventually died in 1870, so something like 50 odd years after her husband, in Jersey. And on her death, what remained of Belzoni's collections passed to her goddaughter. She had lived abroad for years, and although she'd originally had quite a lot of material, including the whole of the 1/6 scale model, the plaster cast of the full-size rooms was sold off after the exhibition and have been lost since 1822. Gradually, some of those pieces had been sold off, lost, or whatever, but still about half of the tomb still existed in this 1/6 scale model when she died, and it was passed to her goddaughter, Selina Belzoni Tucker, who we can see on here, and she comes from a West Country family, which again suggests that Sarah did as well. We don't know what the exact relationship was, but clearly there was one. So there's Selina, who's born only a year before Giovanni dies. And then when she dies without issue, the whole collection passes down to Sarah Ann Tucker down here, her distant cousin, who clearly wasn't necessarily particularly enamored with having crates full of Egyptian-related stuff. So fairly soon after she inherits, about 5 or 6 years afterwards, she gets her son, Charles Wilson, here to dispose of the stuff. And as a result, the whole lot is donated to Bristol Museum in 1900. And this is Bristol Museum as it was. Well, this is the bit which people who are Bristolians will know is now Brown's Restaurant. This is where the current museum and art gallery building is, on the site of Bristol Blind Asylum, which is what that is here. This is the chapel of that, which was the university library at that time. So it shows how much this part of Bristol has changed. But basically, this is where the stuff came to rest. And it took a long time to understand exactly how this stuff had actually arrived, because Charles Wilson worked at a school in London, and that was all that the museum had of him. So why was a Londoner giving this stuff to Bristol Museum? Anyway, but ultimately we managed to trace all this back, and this family tree reveals how the material got from Giovanni to Sarah Belzoni, and on to Selina, and finally on to the Tucker clan. And so therefore, what the Bristol Museum has got from here is principally parts of this 1/6 scale model, another part of it, copied by Alessandro Ricci, who was an amazingly skilled copyist, as well as a sort of proto-Egyptologist. And his copies are, for their period, extremely good, including how good the hieroglyphs are, because when he was copying this in 1818, there was hieroglyphs had yet to be deciphered in a meaningful way, although there are a few clues were already coming out. And the ability to copy signs you don't actually know what they mean is often quite difficult, because unless you know what something should look like, you might end up doing it differently. But actually, Ricci was pretty good, and pretty well all the hieroglyphic signs are pretty well there. Also, a part of the trove which came in 1900 is the only surviving notebook of Giovanni Belzoni's, which has a number of plans of temples in it. And this one is recognizable as the plan of the small temple at Medinet Habu. So although he is certainly sort of one of the rather quite rough and ready, on one occasion he rather tortured uses a battering ram to break down the tomb entrance, he isn't quite in the same category of treasure seeker of which a lot of his contemporaries were. He was genuinely interested in ancient Egypt. The book he writes is remarkably detailed and insightful for its period. And also he collects not only the big fancy stuff, he also collects things like basketry, sandals, and that sort of thing. So in many ways, Belzoni is significantly ahead of his time, although certainly by modern standards, his work is frightful. But by the 1810 standard, he's not bad. And as I say, one thing he doesn't do is hack any bits of the tomb wall out, which, as we'll see a bit later on, somebody who is lauded as the founder of Egyptology did. But we'll get to that a little bit later on. Anyway, so here we are back at looking down into the Valley of the Kings, looking down from the clifftop path. Behind me is Deir el-Bahri. We're looking down at the valley now. And here is where KV17 is, the tomb of Seti I. We're now in a position whereby most of the traditional sort of corner nooks and crannies, if you like, of the valley, the corner places where the earliest tombs were placed, for example, here for Amenhotep II, those have now been used up. And the later, and the kings who are now building their tombs here are having to go for something into the flanks of hills. And although some of the later kings, they're so prominent locations, they never get filled, Seti I is still sufficiently out of the way to have been sealed up since antiquity until late 1817, when Belzoni first finds it. And here it is, as we can see it underground, and you can see it's pretty big. It actually extends, it's by far the deepest tomb in the whole Valley of the Kings, but rather oddly is divided into two sections, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, with the majority of our time being spent in the main section rather than this rather unusual piece off the end there. Here we have a plan of the tomb. It's very similar in its plan to that of Horemheb, the last king of the 18th dynasty, and probably reflects what the plan would have been of the tomb of his father, Ramesses I, had Ramesses I not died prematurely. And so the basic plan is as of Horemheb, which, as we said last week, was effectively the standard plan of the earlier part of the dynasty, but with the bend in the middle taken out. In addition, Seti I also has one additional chamber added in, but basically speaking, plan-wise, it's not a major advance on earlier tombs. Where it does find itself innovating is in being decorated through the entire length of the tomb. As we said last week, previously tombs were only decorated in a couple of locations. Possibly the well room was quite often decorated. The pillared hall at the mid-length might be decorated, and perhaps the antechamber, and of course the main burial chamber itself. But all the other connecting corridors weren't decorated. In the case of Seti, it looks like that was plan A, was to go down that normal route, because there's some differences in the background painting colours between certain rooms, and therefore it looks fairly clear that the intention initially was to decorate the well room here, possibly the room beyond it, and then the antechamber and burial chamber, not the connecting corridors. And indeed, we find that in corridor B particularly, there is unfinished parts, and also this room here is also unfinished decoratively. But even so, there is at least draft decoration on every single wall of the tomb, apart from this storeroom at the end here, and also this descending passageway here. But the rest of it, and from here on in, that is what every king aimed for, was a completely decorated tomb from entrance all the way to the interior. Although, as it turned out, time and chance meant that quite often that wasn't possible. Well, here we have the entrance to the tomb as depicted by probably by Belzoni himself. It's slightly cruder than the sort of stuff which Ricci is doing. But here we have the decorated doorway. So right from the very beginning of the tomb, you have decoration, something which had never been there previously. And then you have the ceiling is decorated with vultures on this first part. And as one goes deeper into the tomb, the vultures give way to simply the night sky, which is something we have seen in other tombs previously. Here we have got the goddesses, the goddess Ma'at, goddess of truth, depicted twice, giving protection to the cartouches, the royal names of Seti I. And on the door jambs here, we have some fairly simple invocations of the king, given the title of the Osiris, which effectively means the deceased. One interesting thing about the tomb here is that Seti's name actually incorporates the name of the god Set. But in Egyptian mythology, Set was the murderer of Osiris, the god of the dead. And clearly, therefore, there was probably some degree of trepidation about including figures of the murder of Osiris in a royal tomb. And therefore, in Seti's names, where normally the figure of the god Set would be placed, there is the figure of the god Osiris, which really confused early Egyptologists, because who is this king Osiri, whereas we already knew about there being a king Seti. So it took a little while to understand what was going on there and place him correctly. And then as we look down here, we can just see here on this side, the doorway, a scene which would then become absolutely standard in royal tombs henceforth, which is the god Re-Herakti, the version of the sun, greeting the dead king as he enters the tomb. So there's a certain processionality, if you like, from the entrance to the tomb where the king is coming into the tomb through to his eternal bedroom, if you like, in the burial chamber. That little vignette is here. And this whole, and say Re-Herakti, form of the sun god Re, and in fact the whole of this first part of the tomb is dedicated to the sun, because it's a text called the Litany of Re, which is a long series of formulae to do with the praise and status of the sun god. Here we can see one of Ricci's drawings of it. Here we see, unfortunately, this bit is missing, so half of this sun disk, which contains the figures of a scarab, which is the sun god at dawn, and also the sun god with, here the sun god with a ram's head, which is the form which he takes at night. So this is the newborn sun. This is effectively the dead sun, and much of what we see in the decoration of this tomb, as was also the case going back to the time of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, is how the transition of the sun god from being effectively dead at sunset to being reborn at sunrise is reflected in what happens to the king. And here you actually got that vignette again with the king with the sun god Re-Herakti in front of him at the entrance to the tomb. And say the first part of the tomb is made up of the Litany of Re, which is, say, this one of these religious texts. The Litany of Re had been turned up on occasion in earlier tombs. Thutmose III had parts of it in his tomb. But from here on in, for most tombs in the Valley of the Kings, this now becomes the standard decoration for the entrance passageway. And this runs on down here. And there's also figures which are part of the litany, are at the beginning of this stairwell. And then at the bottom from this stairwell onwards, we find the amduat, the thing which had previously been the decoration of the burial chamber, right the way down to Amenhotep III. The amduat is now spread through the tomb. No longer do we actually have the whole thing together. Possibly the rots will possibly set in with Tutankhamun and I only having a small extract from the amduat because of the lack of space in their tomb. But as I say, it's a rethinking of the way the royal tomb is decorated. No longer is it simply the amduat in the burial chamber plus possibly Litany of Re earlier on. You've now got a much richer mix of religious texts. Why there is this richer mix, we have absolutely no idea. Part of the problem with studying this kind of stuff is that the Egyptians have not left behind any kind of statements. All we can do is see that some of these new compilations come into existence at certain times, and possibly try and make something out of that. And I think I said last week, the fact that these things all change after the Amarna heresy, the whole Amarna episode, does suggest that there is some heavy rethinking of matters, even after nominal return to orthodoxy. And this carries on down here. There's more of the amduat down in corridor C as well. So as I said earlier on, this bit is unfinished, which suggests what's happened is that they decide to decorate the whole tomb, but because there's going to be workmen coming up and down these stairs all the way, they sort of they do a lot of work deep in the tomb and then work their way back around here. So hence we have unfinished elements in this piece here. And here we've got the ceiling as it is today, and also how it was copied by Ricci. This shows really how important these copies are, because unfortunately, although the tomb was pretty was absolutely perfect when entered by Belzoni, a flash flood not long after he'd opened it flooded much of the tomb, and as a result, the damp damaged both the stone itself, leading to some pillars simply shattering, and also paint started peeling off as well. The reason for this shattering is because the tomb is cut in beautiful quality fine limestone, but directly below it is a spongy shale layer, which is perfectly stable unless it gets wet. If it gets wet, it expands and contracts. So effectively what happened when the tomb flooded was that this layer expanded, and therefore the stone was put under compression. And then as it shrank again, the stone went in the other direction, and stone, if you stress it like that, can just shatter, which unfortunately happened in a lot of parts of the tomb. And the couple of bits and pieces of the tomb which did come back with Belzoni up here, pieces which he picked up off the floor, which had fallen off. Anyway, here we are going down into stairway B. We can see here the Litany of Re, the side. Here are the figures which are associated with the litany. And also, I was saying that this part is unfinished. Also, this lintel here is painted rather than carved. The rest of the tomb is all carved and painted where it's finished. That bit isn't. So again, it looks like this whole area here was left almost till the last minute to try and finish off. And we have once again the goddess Ma'at here and here again, goddess of truth and justice, protecting the route down. And here we've got the Ricci copy of those figures from the Litany of Re. They are all various denizens of the underworld. Quite what they all mean is anybody's guess. I've always thought somebody's having a bad trip when they sort of put some of this stuff together. You've got things who look like fairly conventional Egyptian deities with tightly sheathed figures with human heads. But here you've got odd ones where you've got some kind of disc with something hanging out of it. Then you've got a head of a catfish here, and lots of other weird and wonderful ones where some of them aren't even quasi-human. They are in animal or quasi-animal form. So there's some really interesting stuff going on here. But it's these texts, one of the things which I'm not going to be doing during this course is talk about these texts in any detail, simply because I think it's almost impossible to do so. And also there's a degree of interest here. They are the ultimate in magic formulae. It's one of the reasons why some modern sort of neo witches quite like Egyptian stuff, because it's exactly the sort of mumbo jumbo which sounds good. That's probably not being very scientific, but that's generally my sort of view of this stuff anyway. So hence the reason, if you want to ask me about what it all means, I'll say I've got no idea, apart from there's sort of the big picture about things to do with maintaining the sun and also his nocturnal voyage through the underworld. And here we've actually got that unfinished part here. So you can see here that these signs have all been beautifully carved in the rock, but then the tops of the columns are still in the kind of red and black ink, which we saw last week in Horemheb's tomb. And this rather nice figure of Anubis here is also purely in ink, but below him is the goddess Isis, who has actually been carved, but not painted. This is that lintel I was talking about, whereby the outer part here of Ma'at is carved and painted, but the inner one is purely painted. And although, as you can see, it's not particularly good condition now, but we have this rather nice copy by Ricci of it, of both of these lintels. As I say, once you get into corridor C, we're fully into the Amduat. But then the Amduat stops for a while. We get King and the Gods in the shaft room. Then the Book of Gates, which, as you may remember, is something which appears at the end of the 18th dynasty. It still is all about the sun god's nocturnal voyage, but it does it differently. There's sort of the divisions between the parts of the underworld, the 12 hours a night, are more explicit, and there's other different stuff going on. But those carry on through into this unfinished room here, F. But then when we go down to the next level, to the next corridor, we have the opening of the mouth, which is part of the funerary ceremonies, and is a motif which is found quite frequently in private contexts earlier on. And there is the unique example of the opening of the mouth ceremony being carried out by Tutankhamun's successor in his tomb. But the sort of full version of the opening of the mouth is not found previously in a royal tomb, but now it becomes one of the menu of options. But one of the things is noticeable as one moves through the rest of the history of the Valley of the Kings is that no two royal tombs are absolutely identical. They all choose slightly differently from a menu, but the original version of that menu is very much the tomb of Seti I. And here we are in corridor C, looking up back towards the tomb entrance. Ceiling in not very good condition, also blackening from lamps from 19th century visitors. It's difficult to believe this was absolutely perfect in 1818 before the flood, but that's one of those little tragedies which we can't do anything about now. But luckily, we do have Ricci's copies, so the bits which are missing here are present in the copies in Bristol, and work which has been going on for some years, which I'll talk a bit more about towards the end, to actually do a complete reconstruction of the tomb, benefit massively from what we've got in Bristol to be able to fill in the gaps. And for example, the right-hand wall is in not very good condition at all. This is a photograph from the 1920s. This is the tomb was actually fully photographed by Harry Burton, who was the finest archaeological photographer probably ever, and was responsible for all the photography during the excavation of the tomb of Tutankhamun as well. So the fact that Burton did this is really good. And there's actually a beautiful volume which actually publishes all of these black and white photographs. But when looking at the state of the wall as it is today, and then we can see that we've got the Ricci copies here, so which fill in all those gaps. And also the other wall, which is also in a bad way, which we have this beautiful copy of that part of the tomb. Sadly, we don't have the whole tomb in Bristol, but there's a good proportion of it. And now we move on into the well room, which is also in fairly poor condition. Here we can see the modern bridge put over the well, or well shaft. Which is here, and say that the decoration of this is really goes back to at least the time of Thutmose IV, that the well shaft is a place where the king and the deities get together. And so here we've got part of that showing its current state. But note the background is in grey paint rather than yellow paint we find elsewhere in the tomb, which is part of the reason why we think this was done in phase 1 of the decoration before it was decided to go further. And here we are looking from the well shaft here. This is Osiris, god of the dead, with Anubis and Horus standing behind him. Then we're looking through into that first pillared hall. This is decorated, as I say, with the Book of Gates, or at least parts of the Book of Gates, and then the pillars have the king in the company of various deities, which is a scheme which we saw back in the reign of Amenhotep II, although in that case it was just in black outline. Here we've got the whole thing in full colour, raised relief. So talking about the Book of Gates, well, why it's called the Book of the Gates? Well, these are the gates which are depicted between the various hours of the night. The sun god passes through each of these hours. Each of these hours is a different kind of territory. In the Amduat, he just sort of goes between them, but with the Book of Gates, we have these much more elaborate gates guarded by serpents breathing fire and things like that. And here we actually have the sun god. He's being dragged in his boat through the underworld. And just a couple more views of this particular hallway, showing the decoration of both the walls and the pillars. And this is this is actually the room where we saw the Georgian dandy lounging. So that bench we saw earlier on with the dandy fast asleep would have been across here. This is the so basically this is the room which got a full-scale plaster cast. Sadly, that plaster cast was sold off in 1822, has never been seen since. One suspects somebody bought it thinking they might be able to make some money out of exhibiting it, but found it was all too difficult. So it may have been dumped in the River Thames. We have no idea, sadly. But these are some of the facsimiles done by Ricci from that room, including a couple of a very famous thing is this Races of Man sequence down here, including Nubians, Syrians, Egyptians who are here. So basically there are 4 of some of the principal races of man as recognized by the Egyptians. And in fact, the fact that there were these Nubians shown led to the first attempt at attributing the tomb to a known individual. So at this point, hieroglyphs aren't red, 20 degree. and all that people had got to go on was classical sources. But Thomas Young, one of the early workers on hieroglyphs, had identified the letter P, which was in Seti's cartouche, because his full name is Seti I. And what Young then did was look around in the Greek classical records for any Egyptian king with a P in his name who did something about Nubia, and found that there was Psamtik II, who'd undertaken a Nubian campaign. And for a while, therefore, this tomb was pronounced to be that of Psamtik or Samis. It wasn't until another decade or so later that it was recognized that it actually belonged to Seti I, and also where Seti actually sat in Egyptian history. So for a while, about 10 years after discovery, the tomb was placed around about 600 BC rather than around about 1300 BC, where it actually belongs. And as we move further on into it, we have got the this another gate. Now, if you remember back to last week, I showed you in the burial chamber of Horemheb a scene of the judgment hall. The king wasn't being judged; it was simply he was passing through the underworld. This was part of the underworld. That full-scale judgment hall is never used again. Instead, we have this much more abbreviated one, which shows Osiris accompanied by the goddess of the West, with the king and Horus. So this is very much this is an evolution of the original version of the Book of the Gates, with a much simplified version of the Hall of Judgment. And there we have the actual wall in situ. So see how it works. And then we have to the right the doorway through to the next hallway. As there's damage to all of these pillars, partly probably in the making of the plaster casts, although pillars only used a beeswax based approach, which had minimal damage to the reliefs compared with some later ones, it certainly left some residues on the surface, which had led to them being quite dirty. And there's probably a scope for some further cleaning to be done. But here, which we've got some examples of those of the Ritchie drawings of these pillars. Now, another of these pillars in situ, and now we're moving through into Hall F at the end here, which is here with more of the Book of Gates. But this one is unfinished. All the decoration has been put on the wall by the what the Egyptians called outline draftsmen, who is the master sort of calligrapher, if you like, waiting for the sculptors to come in. But clearly, when they'd finished, they got to this stage, the news came the king was dead, because Seti died after a reign of only 8 or possibly 9 years. So they were clearly assuming there'd be a lot more time to work on the tomb, but it comes to a grinding halt at this stage. Then from back into Hall E, we have a descending passageway going down into the inner lower parts of the tomb. And this is where we're moving into the Book of Opening of the Mouth. However, this area here is an example of where there's a difference between Belzoni's approach to what he finds and what his successors do. Because here, where there should actually be a nice relief here on this door jamb, is now a fairly smooth piece of limestone with the marks from a mason's saw. And indeed, the removal of this door jamb here has also caused part of a collapse here. So this is up in Hall F here. You can look down through this gap into the corridor below. And these are those door jambs, the one from each side here. One is now in Florence and one is in the Louvre. This is because they were sawn away by an expedition which took place 10 years after the discovery of the tomb, jointly sponsored by France and Tuscany, because at this stage Tuscany was an independent Grand Duchy. Italy doesn't come into existence till 1860, but the Grand Duke of Tuscany and also the King of France were keen to fund a scientific expedition led by Jean-Francois Champollion from the French side, who was the person primarily responsible for deciphering hieroglyphs, and also the first holder of the first chair in France related to Egyptology, and Ippolito Rossellini, who was the first professor of Egyptology in Italy. So these are two very distinguished scholars who are sort of leaders of the pack, but when it comes to collecting objects for their museums in Florence and in Paris, rather than just simply removing just portable items, as Belzoni had certainly done, they decided to take away whole chunks of tomb as well. And therefore, what we have here are these two items severed from their origins. We're now moving on into the rest of Corridor G. As I say, this is the opening of the mouth ceremony, basically. And the opening of the mouth is something which is carried out on any inanimate object to make it animate again. So even temple statues have the opening of the mouth carried out on them so that they can be inhabited by the god and actually have a life. And the same goes for the mummy as well. And we see plenty of examples of depictions of this opening of the mouth ceremony, which is whereby a priest holds up various implements to the mouth of the corpse or the statue while reciting various formulae, and these allow allow it to come back to life. And this is and the various episodes from that, because it's carried out multiple times, are shown along the top of the wall here, and they're actually being done on a statue of the king rather than on his mummy, which would be more likely in most private cases. And then at the beginning, overseeing all of this is the king with a table of offerings in front of him, looking on down the corridor. So here we have the current state, 1930s state, and the one of the drawings made at the time. I think it's actually made by Henry Salt himself, this one. It's not one of the Ricci ones in Bristol. But also note here, these sort of look like sort of bomb craters. Well, this is where cartouches of the king's name have been cut out. This is one of the worst parts of the tomb for that. And there's a whole period from the 1820s onwards when the tomb isn't really being protected at all. Although there is nominally some protection for antiquities brought in the 1830s, it's not until the 1850s that anything is really done to provide watchmen and things like that. So for a long period of time, these tombs are the potential victims of vandalism, of people wanting souvenirs to take back to Europe, North America, wherever else. And because the tomb there was such a splash when it was found, people wanted to go in there and they wanted a bit of it. So sadly, that's the other part of the damage. There is the natural damage caused by the flood in 1818, but then there is the vandalism, and also we'll see a little bit later on. Also, people also trying to take casts of some of the images without taking as much care as Belzoni did. Anyway, let's have a little look at the opening of the mouth sequence. So we've got, here are the statues of the king. Most of these originally had nice cartouches with them, but they're have been nicked, as we can see here. Here we've actually got the sacrifice of a bull as part of the funerary ceremonies. So it's actually the first time in a royal tomb we're actually finding things to do with the real funerary ceremonies, rather than just simply what's going on in the next world, in the way to the next world. So that opening of the mouth carries on down G and into H. And then we have another composition, the Litany of the Eye of Horus. This is the Eye of Horus. There's a lot one can say about the Eye of Horus, but it's actually in the conflict between Set and Osiris I'm talking about. I talked about earlier on. Horus loses an eye at one point, and there's a lot, but also it has solar aspects as well. But again, this stuff, don't ask me about the detail. I'll simply tell you what book to read if you want to understand more about some of these rather strange pieces of literature. And anyway, when we then move, and then we come on into Chamber I, which is Kings and Gods. And this is what Belzoni called the Hall of the Beauties. He felt it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen when it was intact. Sadly, that beauty is now something which one can't appreciate the same degree because of the stuff I've been talking about earlier on, because this layer of this shaly level, which is actually known as tafel in Arabic, is directly under here. Basically, clearly people who were building the tomb understood the geology here, and basically when they got to this point, they leveled out, because they knew that they were getting very close to the end of the very, very high quality limestone, which makes the relief work in the tomb such a joy. So here we have it in its current state, both damaged structurally, all this stuff, part collapsed. Here a whole door jamb had to be rebuilt in the early 20th century, because by the beginning of the 20th century, the tomb was almost in danger of collapse. And one of the first things which Howard Carter did when he became Chief Inspector of Antiquities in southern Egypt, which was his job for a significant amount of time before he then went freelance and ended up in Tutankhamun. During his time as Inspector of Antiquities, one of his major jobs was the restoration of this tomb. And so without Carter's work, probably much of the inner part of the tomb would have collapsed long ago. Anyway, so this is one wall of it. It's the sequence of king in front of God, king making offerings to goddess in this case, king making offerings, and so on and so forth. And this is what I mean about taking casts, or squeezes as they're called. There's a number of different ways you can make a cast of a wall. One is by using just dry paper, and then just sort of using a soft brush to make casts. I think we've actually got some of those in the museum, not from here, but from other tombs. The other way is to use beeswax with a liner, which is what Belzoni did, and he was reasonably successful in making the cast without doing any damage. The other is to use wet paper to do the moulding, which then takes all the colour off. And that is one of the things that's happened as far as this is concerned. And there are other monuments. There's a temple in northern Nubia where there are coloured casts of its walls in the British Museum. Unfortunately, at the temple itself, there's not one trace of colour left. And here it's Seti. He is making offerings to the goddess Hathor. And so this is the chamber as it is today, looking through into the burial chamber. Or this actually is an exact replica of the chamber. Over the last 10 years, and is ongoing, there is a project to create a full-scale replica of the whole of the tomb Seti I. Nowadays there is quite heavy rationing as the number of visitors who can come into the tomb, both by numbers of tickets available, but also the price per ticket. It costs something like 10 times the amount to go into Seti that it does to go into the rest of the Valley of the Kings. But there is an aspiration to try and divert tourists away from the real ones to exact replicas. And there is an exact replica of Tutankhamun's tomb already open and available, which I in some ways prefer to visit rather than the real thing. because as far as it's decorated, it's absolutely identical, but rather better lit, and it's easy to get into and stuff. And the plans do the same thing for Seti. And the first phase was to do this chamber and part of the burial chamber. And this actually formed part of a big exhibition over in Switzerland a couple of years ago. And in fact, it's sort of the lighting is better than in the real tomb. So, hey. And the intention is, say, over the next few years, is to do a similar replica for the rest of it. But also they have done, as far as this room is concerned, to show what you can actually do, having got a 3D computer model, which you can then get effectively laser cut, is you can restore the bits which are missing. And this is where the records we've got in Bristol come in, because it allows, because some of the walls have been now extremely poor condition, those are still available in Ricci's facsimiles. So therefore, in the same exhibition, they also produced this complete restoration of the room, showing it as it was in 1818, with, let's say, the detail which is missing restored on the basis of the Ricci facsimiles. Now, they're not using the actual facsimiles themselves, because although they're good, they are not 100% accurate. But what they do is shows what's there, and therefore they can take, almost like they're using sort of Photoshop, bits of similar figures elsewhere in the tomb to reconstruct what was once there. So therefore we've got this shows us what Belzoni would have seen, and also what you can actually do with modern technology. So there is, and then as a comparison with the state of the tomb as it is today. We're moving through from chamber I, the antechamber. We then move into the burial chamber, which, like all burial chambers since the time of Amenhotep II, or at least once it had been completed to the original design, is in two parts. There's a 6-pillared outer hall here, and then you've got an inner crypt with a sunken floor. And in this case, an arched ceiling has been added in. Previously, the ceilings were flat. Now you've got the arched version. And the rest of the Book of Gates is in the initial part of the pillared part of the chamber, plus also some of the other bits are in some of the side rooms. And then you've finally got the Amduat 1 to 3 in the main burial hall at the end. And here we are in the replica. So we say the lighting is rather better than it is in the real tomb. We're moving through from chamber I into that 6-pillared element. And here we are in that 6-pillared element, looking back towards the entrance to I. And we have the pillars once again with the king before various deities. Although on the inner faces, we have got a series of jackal-headed deities who are welcoming the king into his burial chamber. And here another example of how important the Ricci copies are. This is this pillar. Here it is today with this part all broken away. However, here we can restore it on the basis of that figure. And also whole faces of pillars are gone. So here we've got another one from the Bristol. This isn't actually by Ricci. This is actually a second set. When you go through the material for these the 1/6 scale model in Bristol, one finds there's two different sets. There are duplicates of some walls, and one set is much cruder than the other. And it looks like this, for an example, this one, that this set was made possibly for the Paris showing of the exhibition, of the big exhibition, because after it closed in London, it was a Paris version. And it looks as though somebody possibly James Curtin, who was Belzoni's right-hand man, did either himself or got somebody else to try and copy the much finer Ricci ones. And they're not bad. However, they're nowhere near the finest of the original. And it's what you get, particularly at this period, where you've got somebody who doesn't know hieroglyphs, doesn't know Egyptian art, isn't familiar with it, trying to render it. So we have this. On the other hand, though, these second group are more accurate color-wise. For example, they have got the king's headdress here is striped in yellow, whereas in the Ricci ones, it's striped in blue, which is wrong, but clearly there was a mistake made when he was colouring in his drawings, because clearly they wouldn't be doing the full watercolour underground. Presumably it was all done in pencil with notes to what the colours were, which would then be worked up above ground. And Ricci clearly made a mistake over what was blue and what was yellow. Anyway, so some more of these pillars in this area. I say in pretty bad condition. This is because this part is almost directly above this shale layer, and the pillars are taking much of the strain as that shale layer expands and contracts. And again, here we can see one of the Bristol copies of a wall which is now important. In fact, what we've got here is this corner here. So much of the king is missing, as is the god Re-Herakti, whereas this is the Ricci's copy. And I think you can see here the difference in quality between the Ricci copy and going back to what's probably the Curtin copy of a copy. As you said, when we're looking at the section, the remainder of the Book of Gates is either actually in this pillared part of the burial chamber or in the side walls which will open up from it. And then when we're here looking back from the crypt area back into that pillared element. Let's say once we're in here, we've now got the Book of Amduat is surrounding is on with the first hour, second hour, third hour. So actually very similar to what we had in Tutankhamun and I's tomb with the first hour there. So it's actually the full first hour of the Amduat rather than just simply an edited version even of that, which we had in there. And note that there is also this descending corridor below, and also here is the trough of the alabaster coffin of King Seti, which was found there by Belzoni. But we'll come back to that a little bit. So just carrying on, looking back, looking at the wall, looking from the crypt through into the pillared element of the burial chamber. And then a couple of views of the absolutely spectacular space, which is the crypt of the burial chamber. So in contrast to earlier tombs, right, which would have simply had a flat roof going across, there we have this soaring arched ceiling. And it has what we call an astronomical ceiling. It's the first ever royal tomb to have an astronomical ceiling, representing the Egyptians' view of the constellations, zodiacal signs, and so on, which actually are completely different from the Greek ones. So some of these sort of alternative practitioners' ideas about pyramids and sphinxes are all based actually on a zodiac, which isn't what the Egyptians used at all. Anyway, here we have, and you can see what I was saying, it's got a golden background rather than the grey which we saw in that phase one. But also note how the ceiling is being held up by these modern steel joists. Without the early versions of that put in by Carter and so on, this whole lot would have long since collapsed. And this another view, but this case is one of the views taken by Burton, and here, this area here is one of those areas where Carter had to do a major rebuild job. And also there's this arch here, which is not an ancient arch, it's what Carter's done to try and stop the whole lot collapsing. And also that bit had been taken away by another Egyptologist, Carl Richard Lepsius, to the Berlin Museum in the 1840s. So again, the significant hacking out of material from the tomb is down to people who are regarded as amongst the sort of lions of early Egyptology. Whereas Belzoni, who until a few years ago used to get a very, very bad press in encyclopedias and so on, didn't take anything away other than drawings. Here is the ceiling though, absolutely spectacular thing. Again, don't ask me about the detail of this, but this all reflects the Egyptians' view of the night sky. So it's interesting, it's the first time that a king has had such a thing, but centuries earlier, Senenmut, who was the close associate, possibly boyfriend, of Queen Hatshepsut, had one of these in his tomb, which indicates something about his status, but that's a separate issue. But it's interesting, though, there is this private example under Hatshepsut, but then it doesn't become a kingly thing until the time of Seti I. Rather similar, if you think back when I was saying about the Amduat also being an early example of that being in a private tomb of that same Hatshepsut, Thutmose III period, but then becoming a royal only. But here there's even a much larger gap between those two events. And this is Ricci's version of part of that ceiling. As I say, the side rooms also have parts of these of the gates. Prior to this, side rooms were simply storerooms or possibly places to put your prematurely deceased children or spouse. Here they seem to have a much wider role, and as I say, the Book of the Gates is spread into them as well as being on the walls of the main chambers. In addition to the books we've already talked about, Gates, Amduat, Underworld, Opening of the Mouth and so on, we also have the Book of the Divine Cow, which is rather unlike the other sort of texts, which are all to do with the nocturnal states of the sun god. This is more to do with, it's actually a myth. It's to do part of which includes the one of the myths of the destruction of mankind. So quite what that's doing here is slightly unclear, although it appears in later royal tombs and also appeared on one of the gilded shrines around the sarcophagus of Tutankhamun. So this seems to probably be another of these post-Amarna confections. This rather beautiful chamber, unfortunately, very, very badly damaged. The so-called sideboard room, as Belzoni put it, because you've got all these platforms around the edge. What this seems to be is a place for funerary equipment, but rather piling it all on the floor, as was the case previously, they now had the ability to put at least some of the more fragile stuff all on a nice shelf around the wall. So you can imagine this would originally have been packed full of funerary equipment. The pillars damaged both by natural causes and also by having parts removed. The part of this is now in the British Museum, although actually removed by Champollion. It went through various ups and downs before it ended up in the BM. This face has never been recovered. This appears to be the copy, which seems to be one of the copies. The copy. You've got two versions of it here in Bristol, and another one where the this is the this wall, this part here now largely destroyed, but we have one of the original Ricci copies of that in Bristol. So that's now survives, and ultimately it'll be possible to actually be able to reconstruct that in 3D if sufficient money becomes available. Then we come to the end of the tomb, of this part of the tomb, which would have been the end up until in all earlier tombs. But curiously, in the case of Seti I, the tomb suddenly dives further into the rock. Belzoni attempted to excavate it, but never got to the bottom of it, and various other attempts were made to clear it because it got filled with flood debris. And in fact, at certain points, it was so difficult to tell the difference between the flood debris and the layer, which is because we're now into that shale layer I was talking about. It was so difficult to tell what was what that actually there's points where the excavators ended up going into what was actually living rock. But ultimately, it was cleared by Zahi Hawass, the former head of the Egyptian Antiquities Service. And here we find what actually it goes on. Here's a view during the excavations, looking back up it, and here it plunges into the bedrock. This is all through this dodgy, shaly layer, and then at this point it hits good quality rock again, and then at the end of K10 it just suddenly stops, because clearly this is the point where the word comes, the king's dead, we've got to get everything fixed. The whole thing originally was actually initially meant to be nicely, nice stairways and things, but the quality of the rock and everything else has left it to be a pretty awful thing. But what's it for? What's the whole idea of this feature, which is not found, as far as we know, in any other royal tomb? Well, the clue possibly comes in the fact that over its entrance which had actually been blocked up in antiquity. Belzoni found it with paving. Okay, robbers had ripped up some of the paving, but it had been blocked off. This was found. Now, it's a beautiful thing, and it's the first of a series of this kind of thing. A coffin made of alabaster, inscribed with the Book of Gates again. So although there's a full set of the Book of Gates on the walls of the tomb, there's a full set also on this coffin. But the curious thing is that unlike all earlier royal tombs, going back to the time at least of Thutmose III, there's no big granite sarcophagus. This is all there is. So what's going on? Well, what a theory I subscribe to, again, it's a theory because we can't be sure, is that the original idea was that Seti wanted to be buried at the end of this extra corridor. The burial chamber, although it looked like a burial chamber, was not going to be the place he was laid to rest. Rather, he would be deep underground. Why? Well, there is a cenotaph of the king at Abydos elsewhere in Egypt, which has an island surrounded by water as its main feature. And what may be going on is that deep tunnel is attempting to reach the water table, and therefore be able to build a new burial chamber with this island surrounded by water. And that island surrounded by water is probably an evocation of the primeval mound. In Egyptian mythology, creation takes place on a mound which arises from the waters of chaos. And it's on that creation takes place. So it may be the idea, if your body is lying on what should be the mound of creation, it benefits in its resurrection. And if that is the case, there is absolutely no way you'd get a big granite sarcophagus down that corridor. It's simply too steep, and also the dimensions are probably not quite appropriate for it. However, there'll be no major problem in getting that alabaster coffin all the way down to the bottom to this potential burial chamber at the end, had the king not died. So that's probably where that comes in, and that's sort of why this thing is created. Something else made of alabaster which went with it was the canopic chest. Only one corner fragment of that has survived and is now in Sir John Soane Museum along with the coffin. Originally, Belzoni and Salt wanted them to go to the British Museum, but the price which they asked, £2,000, was regarded as being too much by the British Museum, and therefore the architect Sir John Soane, who lived just around the corner from the British Museum, said, well, I'll have it then. Hence the reason why this amazing piece is now in what is actually the smallest national museum in the UK, Sir John Soane's Museum in Lincoln's Inn Fields. And that's what the coffin would have looked like originally. Although the trough is absolutely intact, the lid has been reduced to fragments, and actually only a few bits survive. The face, for example, no part of that has ever been found. And that's just a restoration by Joseph Bonamy, the guy who actually produced this drawing of it. And various bits of the lid keep on turning up in a number of museum collections, but also when other tombs have been excavated in the Valley of the Kings, because some of these things were taken out, these fragments were taken out, then they got caught up in flash floods and went back down other tombs again. So there's quite a few bits of this floating around. And certainly there's enough of it to be able to reconstruct exactly what parts of the Book of the Gates were on which part of the coffin. Also found in the tomb were a whole load of the king's shabti figures. We saw that the number had mushroomed under Amenhotep II, and also the fact that under him the numbers were made up of various different sorts. And so therefore what we've got here is a selection of them. There are these really, really nice big faience examples. Then you've got rather more mass-produced faience examples, some alabaster ones with very simple inscriptions, and a large number of wooden examples like this. And we've certainly got a number of the wooden ones. I think we actually also got one of the faience ones in Bristol Museum as well. And in fact, there were hundreds of these things, and pretty well every museum with an Egyptian collection has got at least one or two of these shabtis or bits thereof. And this is a possibly rather fanciful reconstruction of what the burial chamber might have looked like. This is based on the material which was found in Tutankhamun's tomb, and this is merely a suggestion as to what the burial chamber might have looked like when the burial had taken place, with the alabaster coffin containing probably wooden and probably gold inner coffins, with the shrine around it, possibly the canopic chest also surrounded by a shrine, just as been the case in Tutankhamun's tomb. But interestingly, although we've got quite a bit of material that we found in Seti's tomb, actually we've got less of the general debris than we have in some of the earlier ones. And for example, there are no examples of these big wooden statues of the king and the gods as well. So not quite sure what's going on there, but that's sort of where we are on that. And just to finish off, of course, as I've sort of kept on banging on throughout this course, that the tomb is only part of the funerary complex, and Seti has a memorial temple on the other side of the cliff. So his tomb is about where the V is, the Valley of the Kings, but it's over here. And it's actually fairly well preserved. As I'd said, we've been saying last week, pretty well all of the memorial temples are totally trashed after Hatshepsut. And it's not until we get to the 19th dynasty, which is Seti's dynasty, that we start getting some degree of preservation. And here it is. It originally had a couple of big brick pylon gateways in front, which are now totally destroyed. But the facade with these papyrus columns are rather nicely preserved, as the rest of the facade, although much of the innermost part of the temple is in pretty poor state, including, unfortunately, the actual mortuary chapel of Seti himself, which is just down to a couple of walls. But the basic concept is the same as it really was under Hatshepsut. If you remember that the temple has three parts. There's a central axis dedicated to the god Amun. There is an open chapel courtyard area dedicated to the Re Herachdi, the sun god, and then you have the royal mortuary shrines here. In this case, El belongs to Ramesses I, Seti's father, partly possibly because of what we saw in Hatshepsut, the idea that the king's father ought to have a chapel with his offspring, but also we have no surviving memorial temple of Ramesses I. Indeed, this actually may originally have been it, but then was stopped. It was stopped on the king's early death and then rebuilt from scratch under Seti. So we have Ramesses I memorial chapel, and then M here is Seti's one, but all that's left are the door jambs and the lowest course of masonry. So that brings us to the end of our excursion around the tomb of Seti I. Say one of the finest tombs in the valley, and really say marks a new starting point as far as royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings are concerned, which of course we'll then pick up on next week to take the story through to the end of the use of the Valley of the Kings. So